right. So hi, everybody. I'm really glad to be here. Yeah, we have an amazing lineup. I'm looking forward to hearing other people as well. So just a bit about me. I'm Kirtana Chandrasekaran, and I work for Friends of the Earth International. And this is us, lovely people. And we are a grassroots environmental justice network. And the only things that I'm just going to say, I mean, you can read about what we do. Um, which is relevant to NBS is that one is that we work on a host of different interconnected issues. So I work particularly on food sovereignty and land issues, but we also work particularly on forests and biodiversity, on climate justice and energy, on economic justice and resisting neoliberalism. And so have a kind of rounded view of how all these things kind of knit together, which you'll hear now in my presentation. And of course, our work is very much with social movements and grassroots communities. So everything we do is based on what we see happening on the ground. So that's us, Friends of the Earth. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is nature-based solutions. So, I mean, I think I want to just say three things before I really get into a bit of, the detail of it, is that nature-based solutions is probably not the same as some of the other false solutions that you're going to hear today, like bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, because it's quite vague. And it doesn't have a very clear definition, and that's one of the big problems with it. So it can mean anything to anybody. So partly because of that, and because it's a really like an emerging issue, it's really become like a massive thing, I would say, in the last year or so, in terms of false solutions. We at 4i, we don't particularly have a position on this yet. We have lots of positions on the things I'm going to say, but not on NBS as a whole. And so the reason I want to talk about it, and as 4i, we're very concerned about it, is because it's really rising up the agenda really fast as a big, perhaps one of the primary false solutions that's going to be pushed. And I suspect it will become a justification for another big push for carbon markets at the next COP. So that is why. So I wanted to ask people what you think of when you say the word nature-based solutions. And this is one kind of picture of what people would like. A lot of people who do work in civil society or community groups. So they would say it is things like protecting mangrove forests as kind of a natural solution for resilience to hurricanes and things. Agroforestry, fantastic, is, silver pasture integrating animals and forests and trees for fertilizers, all good stuff. Agroecology, which is the bulk of my work, which is really about, completely transforming intensive agriculture systems into something else that is more just and ecological. Things like peatland restoration, which has been a huge campaign in the UK and across the world for more than 20 years. So there's a lot of organizations who, especially in the UK, I would say, who are quite excited about this terminology of nature-based solutions. And it's kind of understandable because in a way, it is the picture that they want to show is of, all these lovely things that we've been all working on for decades that are now getting attention in the climate movement. And it actually means, climate finance, serious attention in terms of policies, but also maybe, joined up solutions that it could really work. So it's kind of understandable that that's what people would like to see. But the reality of what I'm going to show you is why it's coming up in international spaces, especially, and where the push for nature-based solutions is really coming from. And that is very much linked to the net zero discussion, which is, just to say a little bit, because I'm the first speaker, just in case, people don't know exactly what net zero means, is basically that, all the emission reduction pathways that the IPCC, most of them in the IPCC reports, use two types of carbon accounting. One is actual emission reductions, and one is carbon sequestration. So, taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And so that is what is called net zero, the balance between the two. But in reality, I'm sure you can all guess, having probably worked on these issues, it can obscure a lot of things, like all the things we're going to talk to you about now. And so all of these are, what we're going to talk to you is also called so-called negative emissions technologies. So it also includes things like geoengineering, which we're not talking about now, which is also negative emissions technologies, is also NET, so it's also nets and net zero. So it can be a little confusing, but there's net zero and there's negative, which are negative emissions technologies. So those are the two. And just to give you an example, in the last UK Committee on Climate Change report, I was just happened to be reading through it for another reason. And you can see that the UK, they have raised the UK's contribution from negative emissions technologies to 40% of the UK's mitigation budget. And that's completely insane. They're basically saying that, the UK is going to, 40% of its emissions reductions are going to come from these types of technologies. So at the time it was mainly about BECCS, but now it's increasingly about tree planting, for example, which they all love. So really when the other side, and I'll tell you who they are talking about nature-based solutions, they're talking about things like carbon markets. They're talking about resource grabs and control over resources in the global south mainly. Offsets, which is, I don't think I need to explain what offsets are, but if anyone has a question about that, I will. And of course, PR. Yeah, so that's basically what this is about. And this Net Zero Festival is happening now in the UK pretty soon. I think this is next week or even this weekend, where basically you have all the big corporations, NatWest Bank, Shell, fossil fuel companies, Drax, I mean, the who's who of polluters and some NGOs as well, to come together to discuss how wonderful it's going to be when Shell goes net zero. So, so the first thing to say is that, what is nature-based solutions? And it's a bit vague, and some people there are different definitions, and I'm not going to put all that up because you can probably look it up. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, has one definition. Other places use other definitions, so it doesn't really matter. But it's basically about trying to supposedly using all sorts of different conservation practices and techniques that will also help mitigate climate change. So some people use the term natural climate solutions and nature-based solutions slightly interchangeably. Nature-based solutions tends to be even wider. So it's even things like green infrastructure projects, as you'll see. But the whole push for this natural climate solutions is based on this one paper, basically, which was written in 2018, mainly written by an NGO called the Nature Conservancy, which is one of the biggest well-funded and conservation NGOs who works a lot with different corporations, saying that, we could use so-called natural climate solutions to deliver 30% of global emissions reductions. And that sounds great, but when you actually start to look into, first of all, that paper and the science, and this is what the whole platform of this, what you see on the screen, Nature for Climate, which is a massive initiative with all the big corporations and massive NGOs, and was launched last year, and it's one of the things that really pushed nature-based solutions onto the global scene, is based on this supposed science from this paper. But if you start looking into it, it basically is, a lot of it is about repackaging things that have been tried before and have been massive failures. So a lot of it is essentially red projects, so which reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, and REDD+, which was added on later, which includes also forest restoration and afforestation, which is basically planting trees, tree monocultures to a large extent. So basically half of that, what they calculate, is so-called reforestation, for which they say you need 678 million hectares of land. I don't even know how big that is, but it's very big. Probably half the size of England, something like that is what I read. And the question is, where is that land going to come from? And they make a lot of claims about where it's going to come from. So a big one is about, from reduction in meat and dairy consumption, which is completely unrealistic. But also that land, which has been grabbed for intensive cattle production, actually belonged to forest-dependent peoples in the first place. And there is no land on Earth that exists, as we saw earlier on in the biofuels debate, which does not have some local communities living on it. So, I mean, it's a crazy idea that, you're going to get this amount of land. They also admit that there's going to be 10 million hectares of industrial tree plantations that will be planted in the global south. And that is, I think, something like the size of Greece, that much area. And industrial monoculture tree plantations, I don't need to say anything about it because you're going to hear a lot about it later, come with a huge amount of problematic human rights abuses and problems for communities as well. And then the part that they talk about reducing deforestation, which sounds like a good goal, which it is, for its own sake, not as an offset for Shell. It comes, so the way that they're going to reduce deforestation is that, it comes along with agricultural intensification. So this is a so-called land sparing discussion where you intensify agriculture where it is and try to spare forests. But it's kind of nonsensical argument because, first of all, industrial agriculture is one of the leading causes of deforestation, and you can't decouple them so easily because of, things like feed for intensive cattle production requires land. And if you have more cattle in intensive production, you need more feed. But also just the industrial agriculture model, which is heavily dependent on mining of various things for fertilizers, for example, chemicals, but pesticide use. So it has a massive impact on ecosystems. So it has this very bizarre logic. And also not to mention the social impacts, which is that, the whole model of tree plantations, industrial agriculture, is the leading cause of also the killing of human rights defenders in the last few years. So none of this is kind of taken into account. So if you really look at what this paper is saying, it's a model that's completely unjust because it's expecting those people, as always, in the global south, local communities, indigenous people, who are doing the most to protect nature and doing the least to contribute to the climate crisis, should bear the brunt of these so-called nature-based solutions, which will grab more land. It's an extremely colonialist mindset in terms of, where the land is going to come from. It still is in the frame of the neoliberal logic that we can continue basically along the same lines, consuming the amount that we have with market-based mechanisms, and we're somehow going to find our way out of the climate crisis through all this. And also a very extractive mentality, that forests are really a place to extract more carbon for corporations to continue what they're doing. I'm going to start speeding up, I think. I mean, the other place that nature-based solutions really got pushed is in last year's, in the 2019 New York Climate Summit, which was very high profile and where nature-based solutions was one of the work streams there. And it's led by China and New Zealand, that work stream. And if you read it, it's pretty horrific, some of the things that they are considering nature-based solutions in that. So just I've put two examples here. One is the, Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which is essentially proposing 6 massive economic corridors through ports, energy infrastructure, fishery, you name it, and they're going to build infrastructure through all those in 64 countries around Eurasia. So you can imagine the level of destruction that's going along with this project. And they basically, one of the initiatives is the greening of the Belt and Road, and that's going to be considered as a nature-based solution. The other one is something I talked about earlier, supposedly promoting sustainable and emissions-efficient crops and livestock systems, which essentially means less carbon per unit of livestock produced, which means in extremely intensive systems, which bring down the number of days that the animals will live, the amount of meat, it's really like those economies of scale and production, which will come out much better as like a carbon. So this is going to be considered as well a nature-based solution. So I just want to touch on some of the examples of really why this is super problematic. And one of the big things is resource grabbing for nature-based solution. So last year, again, we had a lot of corporations. So Shell announced that they are planning a 300 million budget for nature-based solutions, mainly tree planting. ENI announced that they are going to plant 8 million hectares of tree plantations in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Ghana. That is actually an area of half the size of England. And at the same time, ENI are involved in a massive exploration for gas in Mozambique, which was found to have the 9th largest gas reserve. And all these corporations are absolutely rubbing their hands because Mozambique has also extremely corrupt government, very bad governance systems, very easy corruption. And they've all projected to spend something like 60 billion USD to exploit these reserves. And it's the largest ever investment in gas in sub-Saharan Africa. And all these projects, so we are working very intensively on some of these in Mozambique. They're already, so the actual extractive projects are going to have already kicking people out of their homes. There have been killings, and it's really, really horrific militarized area, this Cabo Delgado area. And at the same time, on the other side, ENI is then going to take control of several million hectares of land in Mozambique, supposedly to offset the emissions from this project that they're doing. So you can see that the logic of what they're trying to do. So it really is basically, so either they're going to plant forests or supposedly protect existing forests. But once again, the false existing forests are really already being protected by small-scale food producers, peasants, and indigenous peoples and local communities who are living in Mozambique, who are extremely dependent on those forests and the land for their livelihoods. So either way, it's a double land grab. It's like a win-win situation for them. And this is how the nature-based solutions logic is going. The other thing
Kirtana, just want to jump in. Just gonna say one more minute, just because we need to move on to the speaker.
Okay, cool.
Sorry, don't want to interrupt.
I mean, the second thing that I mentioned already is that it's very clear that nature-based solutions is going to be a reason for carbon markets to be pushed again, because they were stopped at the last COP, mainly by a lot of activism from indigenous peoples and environmental justice groups. And now there's several new initiatives for markets for nature-based solutions. So this is going to be the new push. So I think I just wanted to, probably finish up by saying, that it's partly the failure and all the corporate strategies, but also the logic of what they're trying to do. And we've always said that forests are not carbon. Agriculture is not just carbon. And if you do this type of reductionism, it brings you to these kind of crazy situations that they want to have, where nature is, broken down to exist in capital markets. And that's a logic which we have to fight at all times. And maybe the last thing, this is actually the last slide, because I didn't want to finish without saying that, all these are false solutions, but on the other hand, we do have real solutions. And a lot of them is in real agroecology and community forest management, which is, based on all these shared principles and conservation by indigenous peoples is known to be the most effective way of protecting ecosystems. And at the same time, along with that, a massive redistribution of resources and a change in the way we have set up our systems. So, we do have some of the real solutions that we need. And that's it. And there's my Twitter. I'm always happy to answer questions. Thank you.